events@mei.edu, events@mei.edu, or submit your questions on Twitter using the hashtag MEI events. Our team will be monitoring both the email and the Twitter and will send the questions to me. So let's get started. Jim, it has been a tumultuous decade indeed, and it's getting even more tumultuous, but that maybe is today and tomorrow. These polls track the past decade. I'm sure many of our audience members want to get their hands on the book, but haven't had the opportunity yet. So if you could share with us what the project looked like, how you did sort of the polling, and some of the main findings to get started.
Sure. Thank you, Paul. And thanks to the Middle East Institute, and thanks to Nahida for joining us. And obviously, my best wishes go to Kareem and his family. It's a horror to face this in the midst of the pandemic, to have to evacuate a whole community. We've been polling across the Middle East for 25 years. The first 15 I did with my brother John at Zogby International. And the findings there, just to show, are in the book Arab Voices, which covers the period up to 2010. Since 2011, we've been polling annually for the Sorbonne Yas Forum, which is held in the UAE. We provide some content for discussions that take place during the forum. We've been polling across the Arab countries, but also including Turkey and Iran in the findings. We do face-to-face polling. We do maybe 7,000 to 8,000 respondents that are chosen randomly in the countries involved. And tracking those numbers over the decade is what the book is about. It traces the trends and the changes in attitudes that have occurred as a result of what we call the tumultuous decade. When we first began in 2011, there were two events that I think became seminal for the region. The first was the US withdrawal from Iraq. Now, as traumatic as the US entry was, the US exit was as well, precisely because I remember President Obama saying at one point, we have to leave more responsibly than we went in. Well, we didn't. We left in charge a sectarian leader who provoked and aggravated sectarian tensions. And one of the results of that was the emergence of Al-Qaeda, which morphed into Daesh, that became a tremendous threat, not only in Iraq, but then in the broader region, and now even expanding beyond that. At the same time, one of the seeds of the Iraq war was the emergence of Iran, the unleashing of Iran in the broader region. And the repercussions of that continue to be felt even until today. The second was obviously the Arab Spring. And as we capture in our 2011 polling, both of those events were on the minds of respondents as we polled. We've polled since then as I said, across the region in several other areas and on several other issues. And mainly the issues that we've covered are covered in the book. We've dealt with Iraq, obviously, with the Arab Spring fallout, with the Israel Palestine conflict and how it has evolved in the minds of Arabs, but also how it's evolved in the minds of Palestinians. We've polled on Iran, and we've polled in Iran. We're probably the only people who have polled consistently in Iran and been able to track trends in attitudes over the decade. We've polled on issues involving religious extremism and the weaponization of religion. And we've polled on how Arabs, in particular, Arabs, but we've also covered Iran and Turkey, how they view not just the United States, but how they view global and regional powers that have emerged in the region. Let me just discuss a little of what we found. First, on the issue of Iraq. When we first polled in Iraq, we found that people were very worried about the US departure. Actually, it was fascinating because they were conflicted. On the one hand, it was we want you to leave and we want you to leave now. And on the other hand, it was, but please don't leave yet. We got both sets of responses. They wanted the US to leave because they were fed up with the US. From the very first poll that my brother John actually did in Iraq in 2003 in October, we found that the Iraqis did not view this as liberation. They viewed it as occupation. They viewed the US as not sensitive to the needs of the Iraqi people. And they were concerned about what the repercussions would be of decapitating the regime without anything ready to take its place. That over the period of from 2003 to 2011 only got worse. Sectarian conflict emerged into what became a civil war, ethnic cleansing of neighborhoods, the emboldenment of Iran, which began to play a more serious role in the country, et cetera. And so as the US was about to leave, people were in a panic. We want you out because you've made a mess of things and you did this for yourselves, not for us. But at the same time, we're afraid of what the repercussions would be. Well, as our polling shows over the decade, the fears that they had turned out to be true. There was, in fact, everything that they feared would happen in 2011 did in fact occur. And that was, I think, I think an important finding in that as you look down the list of 2011 in rank order of the concerns they had and see how it evolved over the decade, the Iraqi people knew what was going to occur. The next is that we consistently find, contrary to what some US policymakers might say, contrary to what the pundits might think, the majority of Iraqis want a unified country. They don't want, there are sectarian leaders who want it differently, but the majority of Iraqis want a country that's united, including the Kurds. In the last poll we did in 2019, a majority of all the groups say they want a unified country under a responsive government that moves toward national reconciliation. The Iraqis want Iraq, but they want Iraq to be sensitive to the needs of all of its people. They still want support from the United States in the way of trade and in the way of assistance to provide protection for their, not protection, but for training and equipment for their military, but they don't want the US to meddle in their affairs. And interestingly enough, attitudes towards Iran have plummeted, as we saw in some of the recent demonstrations in Iraq. Attitudes towards Iran are really at an all-time low, including now for the first time a significant number of Shia in Iraq who are fed up with the role that Iran plays in their country. I'd also say, and this is a worrisome number that we always look at, and that is on the better off, worse off. Are you better off than you were, or worse off than you were? And then similarly, as you look forward, do you think you'll be better off, or do you think you'll be worse off? The numbers in Iraq are very low. I mean, if you want to see why people were demonstrating, what you have to look at is how they look at both their satisfaction, better off, worse off, and how they look at optimism, pessimism in the future. The Iraqi numbers are very low, as are the numbers in Lebanon, but also as are the numbers continuing in Egypt. So there are some worrisome signs here, but getting back to the rest of the treatment, let's look at the Arab Spring. There was an initial support for Arab Spring. There was enthusiasm. This was exciting, people thought. But the blush is off the rose. And people saw it as something promising, but that didn't deliver. Even in Egypt, you'll see that the numbers have really dropped rather significantly in terms of satisfaction with what happened. Egypt's numbers in terms of looking to the future are bleak, but also as they look back and say, are we better off today? They don't think so. Interestingly enough, there's a loss of confidence in government institutions in Egypt. Even during the period 2010 through the Morsi period, through the initial transfer of power from Morsi to el-Sisi, Egyptians continue to have support for their military. They don't anymore. As we ask Egyptians their confidence in institutions, the military has plummeted almost 40 points, down from a high of in the 90s, where it was 2011, 2012, 2013, to today it's 51. And while they reject the idea of a religious-led government, and they rejected the Muslim Brotherhood, they're not really confident with what they've got right now, contrary to what we're being told. In fact, Egypt is in a problem. Tunisia, on the other hand, is very different. Most Arabs don't look at Egypt as a success in terms of the Arab Spring. Most Arabs still look at Tunisia as a success. And Tunisians do as well. Despite all of the difficulties, despite the fracturing of parties and the difficulty of forming a stable or coherent governing coalition, Tunisians appear to be rather satisfied with what they, with the change that was made. They have obviously concerns about the future, but their better off, worse off numbers are significantly better than most other countries in the region. And so I'd say that Tunisia, in terms of Arab Spring, is viewed by its own people and by the region as a whole as having been somewhat of a success. Yemen, there was an initial support for the GCC negotiated compromise that removed the old government and brought in a coalition government that was to stabilize the situation. There was little support when the Houthi rebellion started. Things got confused and conflicted as the years went on, but in the most recent polling, what we find is that the overwhelming attitude toward Yemen is that it's a humanitarian crisis and it needs to end. There's a sense that what's to blame is partly Iran, partly other countries in the region who've gotten involved, partly tribalism and an inability of Yemen to exist as a coherent country. But the real concern is pushing aside all the problems. The issue is it's a humanitarian crisis that has to be addressed. Syria is a fascinating issue because in the very beginning, there was strong support for the opposition. And overwhelming majorities in every country said Assad must go. I mean, echoing what President Obama had said. As the years have gone on, there is a growing begrudged acceptance of the fact that Assad's going to be there. They're not happy with the regime. They're not happy with Iran's involvement in and I'll talk about Iran and Syria in a little bit. But at the same time, there's a sense that, look, they tried to get rid of him. They can't get rid of him. He's going to be around. But there's concern that as long as he is around, the conflict is going to continue. Conflict between the regime and the opposition, but also conflict between Russia and Iran in the future, and conflict between Russia, Iran, and Turkey in the future. So the Arab world sense about Syria is, again, it's conflicted. They accept the fact the regime's going to be there, but they're worried about what the future is going to look like. Let's look at Israel Palestine, because I think the numbers here are
Jim, if I may,
yeah.
If I may, let's to categorize the discussions a little bit. Let's pause a little bit on this Arab Spring moment. I want to bring Nahida in for her views on that, and then we'll go back to some of the other issue areas. Sure. I also have a number of questions that came in on the Arab Spring, and that's already a very rich palette. Nahida, let me go to you for your thoughts, particularly on the the Arab Spring, public opinion about it, and what you see.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you. I'm very happy to be here. Yes, thanks. First of all, my views are more of a journalist. As you said, I am a journalist. I'm not with France 24 anymore, but I've always been a journalist, so I have a less academic view of things. I'm fascinated by public opinion, Arab public opinion, and fascinated by the polling of it, because up until now, a lot of us speak about public opinion in the Arab world that don't really know what it is and what it means. And thanks to the polls of James Zogby, we have a clearer idea. Now, if you remember, we used to call the Arab public opinion the Arab street, condescendingly. We thought that it was mainly people who got angry, who went down and screamed and yelled and broke things, but then did not change anything. And with the 2011 Arab Spring, or I prefer to call them Arab Revolution, because in fact, besides Tunisia, most of them were not a success. Arab people started reacting, and we were quite surprised. We were surprised because they reacted after years of not moving, and we were surprised that it happened in Tunisia. Tunisia is not the most, the poorest of the countries, and the President Ben Ali at the time was not what you would call a dictator. Of course, it was a police state. It was a corrupt state, but there was not that level of poverty and that level of repression that we saw with Saddam Hussein and others. What also was clear was the importance of this feeling of humiliation that the famous Mohammed Bouazizi, who sparked the revolutions, felt. What is it? I would just remind viewers the story of Mohammed Bouazizi. This was a street vendor who had gone to university but could not continue because he didn't have money. He had to support his family. And so he could not find a job. And so he started selling fruits and vegetables, but he did not have a license for that. So he kept on being arrested. And the last time he was arrested, he got very angry and he felt extremely humiliated. Some people say because a woman policeman was very tough with him. Some people say she hit him, but in fact she didn't. But the result is that he burnt himself alive. This was extremely violent, extremely cruel way of protesting. And he became the sparkle that sort of grouped all the ills of the Arab world, which are, yes, this feeling of that their dignity is being hurt, that it's been hurt for ages, be it because of wars and the fact that they were displaced most of the time because of the successive defeats, mainly in the Arab-Israeli conflicts. But there it was also the unemployment, the fact that they aren't even allowed to work and live. What happened then, and this is what is extremely interesting in the Arab revolutions, is that it wasn't just the poor people. Mainly when we see how it spread thanks to smartphones, it spread thanks to social media. And those who were using these smartphones and social media were professionals, and they were mainly middle class. And we saw them contacting little by little and connecting with other Arabs. In Tunisia, for instance, they were translating some of their messages that were originally in French, in Arabic and in English, so that the Egyptians and the others could see what was happening. So yes, it became, for the first time, public opinion started meaning something for the Arabs, and meaning something not only for the people, but also for the governments. And but Jim said it, and this is extremely important too, that none of the countries that experienced the revolutions, besides Tunisia up to a certain point, because many of them are still worried and unhappy, and now it's very hard now to know exactly what the situation is because of the COVID-19, but yes, they are happier than others, but nobody is really better off. The question that would really be interesting to discuss here is, are these revolutions going to make things worse on the long run? We know that for the moment there are some terrible consequences, mainly in Syria. But will in 5 years things be better? Can we see what is happening in Sudan, what happened in Sudan, what is happening now in Lebanon, with all the problems that Lebanon has as well that are mainly economic? Are they going to be better? Or will ever these revolutions have a positive effect? Then I'm happy, if you wish, we can go through the various countries, the three main countries of the revolutions later, if there are questions on it.
Thank you, Nahida. Thank you very much. And that also, I mean, connects to a few questions that have come in from the audience in a similar vein that I'll pitch maybe to Jim for his response. One audience member asks, has the failure of the Arab Spring been exaggerated? I mean, obviously, the failures are obvious. You said the bloom is off the rose. We've seen what's happened in Libya and Syria and Yemen for sure. But as Nahida herself is asking, and as maybe events in Iraq, Lebanon, and Sudan, at least before COVID, there is something still alive there, and there still is a demand. So the question kind of is, do you view that momentum or that force of the Arab Spring as something that happened and failed, or something that maybe is stumbling, but is still a very major force for the future? A second question from an audience member, Vijay Nilekani, if I'm reading the name right. This is, I suppose, a direct public opinion question. Jim, is there any country in the Middle East that has support in its public opinion for a modern secular democracy with minority rights enshrined in a constitution? Basic question. So Jim, over to you.
Thank you. With regard to the first question, I think to some extent, the packaging of Arab Spring, which was a Western device, was wrong and created a sense of expectation that because what we tend to do is when you see an event unfolding that you don't understand, you try to understand it through the prism of something that you did understand. So everything became, after Beirut in 82, everything became Beirut, or after Paris, the riots, and everything became Paris, or everything became the civil rights movement, or whatever. And the Arab Spring became the spring because it was viewed as the Prague Spring or the fall of the Iron Curtain, something that would be organically linked with the fall of the Soviet Union and the loss of control of the communist parties. And therefore there was this organic movement in all the countries of Eastern Europe, somewhat simultaneously. It came out different ways. Romania was not as successful as Czechoslovakia, for example, but they were all seen as one piece. Similarly, I think the same thing happened in the Arab world. People saw Egypt, and they saw Tunisia, and then they saw Tunisia rather than Egypt, and then the beginning of stirrings in Yemen, and they said, "Oh my gosh, it's happening." Well, it wasn't happening that way. These were issues peculiar to each country. And yes, there may have been activists in one inspired by others, but I think that the expectations that were set because of a false view of what was taking place were way too high. But has the sense of what people want as a driving force for change, has that dissipated? The answer is no. As you see in Algeria and in Sudan and in Lebanon and still in Iraq and even to some extent in Iran, et cetera, no, it's still there. When we poll and ask people what their priorities are, it's still jobs. That's number one. And it's still education that prepares them for jobs. And as long as those basic needs are not met, there will be stirrings for change. And I think you're right. The COVID-19 has actually sort of put a bit of a damper on it, but at the same time, it could be an accelerator because the situation will only get more desperate in many of the countries. So no, I don't think that the spark of people feeling that they have to empower themselves if their government or their structures of governance are so ossified and so unresponsive that they can't provide basic needs, that they have to take it on themselves to demonstrate their desperation and their upset. I think that is a spirit that is alive and will continue.
Mm-hmm. And the question, is there any country in the public opinion polling that says, yes, we want a secular modern democracy with minority rights enshrined in the Constitution? You see democracy in the polling. you see jobs in the polling, but do you see?
Yeah, we see democracy, we see jobs, and what we see is interpreted differently in different countries. The country actually, and this may surprise some because it doesn't fit the mold, but the country that has the most progressive citizenship in terms of what people expect the future to look like and their satisfaction with the present, et cetera, is the UAE. I mean, even in questions that we've asked in other polling, not the polling for Surbani-Yas, but in other polling we've done on religion, when we ask questions about should non-Emiratis be given citizenship, should non-Muslims be given citizenship, the answers of the citizenry are very high, yes. While there are problems with labor, as we all know, the citizens in the UAE, when you poll them, they feel that labor should be treated fairly and equitably. So this is a case where you have, I think, probably from the spirit of the founder, Sheikh Zayed, a sense that they can continually do better. There isn't angst in the country over governance issues. But there is a progressive sense of where the future ought to be and what it ought to look like. In other countries, not so much. I think we might, I always wondered about Oman, but we've never polled in depth in Oman on these issues. Whether or not the vision of Sultan Qaboos sort of was institutionalized in public opinion in the way Sheikh Zayed's vision was institutionalized that way. Lebanon also has an interesting mindset on these issues. The Lebanese parties may be very sectarian and scrambling for their control of the corrupt pie, but the Lebanese people want one man, one vote. I always wondered if somebody ran for office in Lebanon on a platform of what the people want rather than what their sect expects, whether that person could win or not. They want one man, one vote. They don't see sectarianism as helpful to the future of the country. They identify themselves as Lebanese principally over their sect, and they want all the various communities respected equally. That's not the way the country's governed, but that's what people want.
Indeed.
So that's kind of what we found.
Thank you. Jim, I'm very aware of time. So let's move on to, you were starting to lay out
Israel,
the findings on the Arab.
I'll go through them. Israel Palestine is interesting because we've polled both among the Palestinians, and I must say the Palestinians have lost hope in the United States, and they've given up in many ways hope in the future. They no longer strongly believe that their future is going to be better. This two-state solution, they just don't see it happening, but they don't know what a one-state looks like. And so there's a sense of confusion and or consternation about what the future looks like. They haven't given up, obviously, but at the same time, there is no clear sense of where they're going, how to move forward. With regard to the broader Arab world, there is no love lost for Israel. They are still seen as the #1 problem, the reason why there's a conflict. They've lost hope in the United States. They'd like the US to play a positive role. They don't see it as capable of doing that, whether Democrat or Republican. They just see the country, the US, institutionally incapable of playing a positive role. What we have found is that while the issue resonates deeply, it is no longer seen as a priority. And I think in many ways, because there are so many other fish to fry, and because it seems hopeless, and because people just keep dying, for the first time in the last year that we polled, we actually found people saying that they thought maybe normalization was a good thing. Not because of any love lost for Israel, but because it might give Arabs leverage over Israel to solve the Palestine problem. At least it would stop the killing. Interestingly enough, while it's packaged here as normalization paves the way for a united front against Iran, in all the qualitative, when we ask people, why do you think this? Iran never comes up. What comes up is they're tired of seeing people die. Maybe this will give us some benefits and able to help the Palestinians move forward, etc. I wouldn't make too much of this, as I think some Israelis may want to. There is no, also in the qualitative, there was no love for Israel in this. And I think that any spark at all would set the dynamic in a very different direction. I think the problem right now is that the issue's on the back burner in many ways. And with Iraq in flames and Lebanon in turmoil and Syria being still what it is and Iran threatening and Yemen, etc. There are many other issues percolating, and Palestine has been somewhat on the back burner. On the issue of Iran, again, we polled in Iran and we polled in the region. And I'll just make two quick observations about Iran. One is that when the focus of the region is on what Israel is doing in Lebanon or what Israel did in Gaza or the Palestinians, or when it's on the United States and what the US is doing in Iraq, for example, from 2003 on, the opinion of Arabs of Iran is very high. But when the focus shifts to what Iran is doing in the region, then public opinion of Iran plummets. So that while Iran's numbers were high in 2006 and 2008 and 2009, when we polled, by the time you got to 2011, they were in the basement. And they were in the basement, and I said it this way, I said Syria was the nail in the coffin of Arab public opinion of Iran. The first sort of chink in the armor was when Hezbollah turned its weapons against demonstrators in Beirut. And people saw that the intention, the resistance was not resistance against Israel, but it was carving out a piece of the action in Lebanon. They wanted to be the state within a state in Lebanon. That began to turn public opinion. Syria ended it. And today, when we poll Arab attitudes towards Iran, the number one issue is Iran's nuclear program, which it had never been a big issue before. And the second is Iran's meddling in the region. Among the Lebanese in particular, and among the Iraqis, interestingly enough, among Shia in Lebanon and Shia in Iraq, the favorable numbers toward Iran are much lower than they've ever been before. In Iran, Iran's public, like the publics across the region, want jobs, education, healthcare. Those are the priorities. It's no big deal. I mean, everybody in the world sees those as priorities. When the country is threatened, there is support for the government, whatever stupid things the government is doing. And that's normal. When a country is threatened, its citizens galvanize and come to support the government. When the government is not being threatened, people turn their attention toward the government and what it's doing or not doing. So what we found was that during the negotiations over the JCPOA, and then after when the treaty was actually signed, people were not happy with their government. And they were not happy that the government wasn't spending enough on jobs, was not doing enough to protect personal freedom, and was wasting money on foreign adventures. As soon as Trump came into office and began attacking the regime and began reimposing sanctions, the numbers flipped. And people began to not want so much attention paid domestically as they did want support for their government. It might seem counterintuitive, but it makes sense. Let me go to extremism. Simple. Arabs do not favor either the politicization or weaponization of religion. And when you ask them, when religious movements take over government, are they a success or not? The answer is they're not. The only places where they thought that they were a success was Turkey, and a couple of other exceptions along the way. But for the most part, Arabs do not. A majority of Arabs don't see the politicization, but in particular the weaponization. Movements like Al Qaeda and Daesh are viewed as an abomination of religion.
Let's talk about Turkey. I mean, what's your view of your polling in Turkey? How has public opinion shifted and shaped there?
We have some problems in Turkey sometimes. It's the one country where I think of all the ones people in Iran will tell us the truth. When they're dissatisfied with the government, they'll tell us. In Turkey, people are not as open in telling us when they're dissatisfied. And so I'm not always confident that the numbers in Turkey about their government are going to be as constructive or as helpful as you'd like them to be. In every other country in the region, we get answers that make sense in an interesting way. I mean, when you ask Saudi Arabia, Saudi Arabians, is your country a positive force in the region? Or is Iran a positive force in the region? And you get a significant number of people, 7, 8, 15%, something like that, who say Iran's a positive force. And you look and you see where the demographics are, they're Shia in the Eastern province who are saying that. People are telling you the truth when they say stuff like that. That's a dangerous thing to say for some. When we mistakenly asked a question in Saudi Arabia, favorable, unfavorable attitude towards Saudi Arabia, we always, in the country that you're polling in, we don't ask Egyptians they're favorable, unfavorable toward Egypt, but we made a mistake and left it in Saudi Arabia, and we got unfavorable attitudes from 11% in Saudi Arabia. It was, again, Eastern province, and it was Shia. So, people are bold enough to tell you the truth, and that's a kind of interesting phenomenon all by itself. Palestinians, Lebanese, Iraqis in particular are very, very honest in telling you what they think. But let me get on just the issue of other attitude toward other countries, because one of I think the long-term consequences of the Iraq war is that while the Project for a New American Century saw it as securing American leadership for the next century, it did exactly the opposite. It was supposed to create a unipolar world. It ushered in a multipolar world. And today, the US is in decline in the region, no doubt, despite Donald Trump's protestations otherwise. And we are competing with China and with Russia as global powers, but in the EU, we're also competing with regional powers like the Saudi Arabia or Iran or Turkey. And that phenomena of a multipolar region is one of the consequences of the Iraq war. And we find it in our polling, where the US is no longer viewed as the most dependable ally. It is viewed as a dependable ally in a couple of countries, but in most countries it is not. And it has been eclipsed by either Russia, China, or some cases Saudi Arabia. Iran is not any longer viewed in that way, although a significant number still of Iraqis, while overall opinion in Iraq has sunk, there still is a body of opinion in Iraq that sees Iran as an ally. But that issue of multipolarity, I think, is one of the outcomes also of this tumultuous decade. Now, I just want to say, as we go into the next decade, as the withdrawal from Iraq and the Arab Spring sort of set the stage for the events that would follow, I think that the pandemic is going to be setting the stage, and how governments respond or are incapable of responding to the pandemic are going to set the stage for the next decade. And that is something that remains to be seen, how that plays out. But thank you very much. And I hope people will buy the book. And I want to give a special thanks to my two partners in this, my daughter, Elizabeth, whose extraordinary editing and researching and sort of collecting the numbers helped make sense of it. And my daughter, Sarah, whose graphics helped make sense. I mean, the book is chock full of graphs and charts and tables that actually help make sense out of 10 years of a lot of conflict, sort of confusing data. But when it all comes together, it does make sense. So I thank them very much for helping me get this book done.
Yes, indeed. And to our audience, we've put the link to the book on the chat function, so you can see it there, or you can just Google it. It's on Amazon. You can get it as a Kindle, or you can get it as a physical book. And I obviously encourage you to do so. Let me turn to Nahida for any reflections you might have on the many things that Jim was talking about. But let me throw to you one of the questions that our colleague Karim Sajadpour, who could not be with us today, wanted to put on the table. and that either, Nahida, if you have views, or later Jim, how would you differentiate between how Turkey generally sees its relationship with Iran and how the Arabs, of course, the Arabs have, there's a lot of different Arabs, but do you see, is there a parallelism there, or do the Turks view their relationship with Iran through a different prism? I mean, obviously there's the war in Syria where they disagree, but we've seen Turkey oppose the US withdrawal from the JCPOA and sort of take a different line on things. Any comments on anything Jim said or on that question that Karim posed, Nahida?
I will get back to the question of Karim later and maybe let Jim answer the part on Turkey and Iran. What I looked and I found in the book that was extremely interesting is the fact that, yes, the priorities today mainly are basic human rights and basic rights like security, jobs, health services. And what is amazing is in the charts, one of the charts that Jim just showed is that democracy in some charts just does not exist. I mean, people do not believe that democracy is a priority. Does that mean that the Arabs don't want democracy? I don't think so. I think basically that they have other priorities to secure before they get to more plurality in their countries. They want good governance. Therefore, once democracy is not possible without voting in Islamists like the Muslim Brotherhood, then it's better to have what we would say good governance with strong leaders. And another point that is extremely interesting in the book is that it's clear that most Arabs, and namely in Egypt, where they felt it, and in Tunisia as well, they do not want the Muslim Brotherhood to rule, to be in government. That does not mean that they want them totally out. They would probably accept their presence as a social force, but not in government. They're not very keen on having the military either. And at this moment, they do not have the proper secular leaders that can take over, except in some countries. And he is right about the United Arab Emirates, where there is more support for a good governance, in a sense, which exists there and does not exist in other places. This makes us think about something that we should really all be looking into. If democracy as it is seen in the West is not what they are really looking for, at least this is not what they say they are looking for, are they looking for, and should we also be thinking of what can be a good suitable system for the Arab world in the meantime? We've seen that the economy is extremely important. Are there today leaders that through the economy, through what Jim just said about the COVID-19 and the management of the pandemic, will we see the importance of good governance, no corruption, good economy that will need to be secured before we go to the votes and before we go to a Western-style democracy? Also, another point that is important is the cooperation between Arabs that was shown in the polls, and less foreign interventions. By foreign interventions, they mean the Turks, they mean the Iranians, they mean the US and the Russians, and therefore, what the Arabs in general, Arab opinion can think about Iran depends in many places. We've seen, and Jim stressed on it, what happened in Iraq. In Iraq, we feel that there are now more Arab Iraqis and less dependent and less keen on having a big Iranian influence. We saw this in Yemen as well. And we saw in the polls as well that people in the Arab world consider that the Iranian intervention in Yemen was one of the major things responsible for the war in Yemen, more than even the Saudi coalition. This also in Lebanon. Lebanon is definitely controlled now in big part by the Hezbollah, be it security-wise, be it in parliament. So you have at least half of the population that is happy with this, and probably the other half that is not happy or even worried about it. So I'll just let Jim answer the Turkish-Iranian part.
Thank you, Nahida. Yeah, Jim, over to you with Karim's question. Is the Arab-Iranian relationship different than the Turkish-Iranian one in opinion polling?
I can't really say, because it's not an issue that we've asked questions about. I don't think we've ever asked Turks for their attitude toward Iran. We did ask them about their attitude toward what concerns them most about Iran. And we gave them 9 choices, and the top choice was Iran's involvement in Syria, and followed by the nuclear program. But whether or not they have a different view than the Arabs, I can't speak to that. They, like the Iraqis and the Lebanese, viewed the #1 concern about Iran something very close to home, and that Iran was on their border and they weren't happy about it. I would say that that the Arab attitude toward Turkey is not much different than the Arab attitude toward Iran. Turkey has not been as malign a character as Arabs view it as Iran, but nevertheless it has intervened in Syria in particular, but also in other countries. And this sense of the Ottoman effort at a kind of a re-establishment of the empire, and Erdogan is not viewed favorably in that regard. On the issue of priorities, it's interesting. Let me just say that I think that maybe the best and least reported speech that Obama gave on this issue was the second anniversary of the Cairo speech, where he talked about the Arab Spring, and he said, in effect, we didn't start it, we can't direct it, and we can't determine its outcome. But what we can do is be helpful to democracy. And he said, it was like, we're not helpful to democracy by preaching it. We're helpful by providing it with the investment they need to create jobs, the investment they need to improve education and their healthcare system, so that they can move into the next phase of building a middle class, et cetera. And I thought to myself, this is not a speech for the Arabs, this is a speech for Congress. Shape up your foreign aid program and make sense. Because when you look at where we gave aid versus what Arabs' priorities were, we gave aid and support to all the things they don't want us to be involved in. I mean, who wants another country to be involved in creating a democracy in their country? It's sort of like, would Americans want Sweden to actually come and run our healthcare system? And the answer is no. It's like, we should do this on our own.
At this point, I wouldn't mind that, Jim.
Pardon?
At this point, I wouldn't mind Sweden coming in and giving us.
Except that it wouldn't sell, right? It'd become. I mean, my point is, in other words, when you ask people what they want other countries to do, they want jobs, they want education, they want healthcare. Those are their priorities, and that's what. If you want to help us with that stuff. But Nahida's right. All those issues that we focus on, they don't focus on as priorities, even though they are concerned about women's rights. They are concerned about democracy and protecting their their personal freedoms. But if you give me a choice between that and a job, I need a job to feed my family. That's where the priorities are. And I think we missed the boat on a lot of this.
Let me, Jim, in the minutes remaining, do kind of a lightning round with you to get in a number of extra questions from the audience. One quick question. Do you have done polling in Qatar and Morocco?
We've done polling in Qatar in particular on education issues and on youth ambition and youth, and we did that for a private client that it's a private poll. So let me say, most of our polling is on the website Zogby Research Services. All of the data of the last, the individual polling is there from the last 10 years, and a lot of the other polling that we've done that's not related to Surbaniyas. But some of the private polls we've done, no. Morocco was a country that we always included in Surbaniyas polls, and so some of the data from Morocco is in this book. But in recent years, we shifted to Tunisia. And so because we're limited in the number of countries we can do, but in some of the other polling that you'll find on the website, in particular on issues involving religion, you'll see a lot of Morocco numbers there.
Okay, on another question, could you provide some detail or granularity when you say the public opinion about US not being reliable, not being a sort of a steady partner? Is that related to who's in the White House? Is it just the general position? Was it high under Obama, low under Bush? What can you go beyond the general statement of it being not very reliable?
It's in the book. The most recent polling is in the 2019 full report, which you can get on the Zogby Research Services website. It doesn't matter who's in the White House. There's always a peak. Numbers go up when there's a new president because they think, oh, things are going to change. When they don't change, they plummet right back down again. Only in the UAE and Saudi Arabia are there, as of last year, some favorable attitudes toward the US. Those are the only two countries where it is favorable. But in the UAE and Saudi Arabia, when you ask, are your attitudes toward US policy toward Syria, Iraq, etc., are they better than they were or worse than they were 2 years ago? And you'll find the numbers have dropped significantly in all those countries on almost every issue. So Obama numbers went up and then numbers went down, etc. And Bush numbers went up and then numbers went down. So it really is a question of, at this point, a sense that it really isn't going to change. They've lost confidence in the US's ability, regardless of who's in the White House, to make a difference in the region.
A question about the Palestinian polling. You've described that most people don't really have hope in a solution, certainly no confidence in the US and so on. The questioner is asking, is there emerging in Palestinian public opinion, are they turning to any other? Is there any other potential mediator? If it's not the US, is there anybody else that they're looking to, or is it not?
The EU is where they look. The problem is that, as I've said recently, the EU is like the Susan Collins of international diplomacy. Maybe they'll do something good, but then they always end up disappointing because they can't get their act together as a unified whole. So there's disappointment. Interestingly, they continue to support the Arab Peace Initiative. They just don't think it's going to happen. And that, I think, is, when expectations are high, we're high, and then are disappointed, and people feel nowhere else to go. That's a worrisome situation, and I think that's where we are right now.
Maybe this is the final question, link two questions together. If you could say a few words about your polling methods, not the detail, but particularly link it to where we are today in the pandemic, and the question of, will you be able to continue to do this kind of very valuable work? Are your methods affected? Is it only by phone? How does it work?
We haven't been able to do any polling for months now, and precisely because we will not do phone polling and we will not do online polling, except in very few circumstances. In the UAE, you can do online polling. There is no country other than maybe the UAE where the database of available addresses are large enough where you can get a reasonable sample, figuring that you can cover a representative sample of the population. No other country can you do that. So when we've done online polling, and sometimes we've tested online polling and then direct face-to-face polling in Egypt, for example, you find the numbers are so wildly different that you just can't trust the online polling because it's a very select universe. It doesn't represent the population as a whole. Telephone polling is problematic. I mean, to call somebody in Iran on the telephone and say, what is your attitude about the government's performance on personal freedom, is bound to get you a hang up. So we don't trust that either. The face-to-face polling has worked for us. It's more time consuming. It requires actual boots on the ground, but it's actually worked. And our numbers have been reliable over the years, and we feel good about it. So we're waiting until this passes, and hopefully, you know, we'll be able to get some new work when it's over. But yeah, we've been on hold since the pandemic hit.
Okay, Jim, I want to thank you, well, for all the work you do, all the work you've done over the years. We haven't even gotten into your involvement currently with the Democratic Party and upcoming elections in the US, which that might be the subject of another session. This was a book launch, so the point is for people to read the book, get the book. It's an amazing resource. And I want to thank you, Nahida. Yes, sorry.
Buy the damn book.
Buy the damn book. Okay, buy the damn book. I got it.
Yeah.
Quote unquote. Yes, thank you.
Direct, yeah.
Yes. And Nahida, thank you for joining us from the French countryside. I know you're
It was a
suffering out there,
pleasure.
but good luck to you. And we really wish our friend and colleague Karim Sajadpour, who I mentioned at the top of the broadcast, happened to be in Michigan. 2 dams have failed and his town is being evacuated. So we hope that he and his parents are well. Thank you for our audience. We had about 130 people on the Zoom, and many dozens more were following us on YouTube. I don't have the exact numbers there. This has also been recorded, so it will be available on our website, and I imagine the Zogby website as well. So thanks, everybody. Stay well, stay safe, and we'll meet you again. Jim.
With regard to the questions that didn't get answered, I will try to respond to all of them on the chat site so that people can find the answers. Okay?
Great. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, everybody. Have a good week.
Thanks.
Is it over?